Hello, and welcome back to France Made Simple, the podcast where I demystify life in France, tell it how it really is, and try and debunk some of the many myths that surround living here. So today we're talking about building, and in particular building plots, which are known in France as terrain à bâtir, literally ground to build on. Because whilst lots of us move to France to renovate properties, and that is very lovely, there are other people who, for whatever reason, want to start afresh, so to speak, start from scratch. And sometimes, even if there is an existing building on a plot, it will be literally such a pile of rubble that we are talking new build. So there is a solution in France which is very popular, which is what's known as a lotissement, which is a very small scale housing estate, normally with anything between 4 and 20 properties on them. But many of us dream of building a property far away from any other buildings or neighbours or people or noise or disturbance. So this is where building on an isolated plot becomes an attractive option. However, these type of plots are becoming much, much harder to find, and they do tend to command a premium price. And they also come with their own set of issues, none of which are insurmountable, but they need to be addressed. The upside is that these type of isolated plots are often found in really stunning locations, and your finished property is also going to command a premium price eventually because of that location. And again, location is always a really personal issue, but for some people, an isolated plot does have many advantages. One big attraction may be the seclusion because it's away from other people or buildings or noise or disturbance. And equally, individual plots often tend to be larger than those found on lotissements. Or even if they are very, very small, if it's the only little bit that's constructible, then you feel you're on a big plot because there's nothing around you. And there may also be the possibility to purchase extra land, which if you've got animals or intend to have animals, that can be a big plus factor too. Now, in some cases where there's an existing structure of some shape or form on site, there may also be outbuildings which can be rebuilt, and these can be sort of added to the overall size of the property. Now, whilst you're unlikely to be given planning permission to convert these into proper living accommodation, extra outbuildings are very, very useful for a variety of things. And you never know how much space you need until you have an ability to kind of expand. Those of us that have come from the UK and just have a garden shed really appreciate the fact that you might have a 40 square metre outbuilding, and it's amazing what you can find to do with it. And equally, if you do discreetly convert that into kind of overflow guest accommodation, shall we say, and you're in the middle of nowhere, nobody's going to bat an eyelid if Granny comes to stay in there for a couple of weeks in the summer. The other big advantage of more isolated plots is that they often, unlike lotissement plots, come complete with, established vegetation. So the presence of trees, fruit trees, shrubs, that's another big plus factor for many of us who move to France and want to garden and love gardening. So, how do you go about finding such a gem? Well, some plots like this are sold through estate agencies, but I think the vast majority tend to be private sales, and often they come on to the market after somebody's died. So there's what's known in French as l'héritage, so an inheritance. Now, this can be a whole minefield because everybody that inherits has to agree. And this can be complicated, but that's generally the reason why these type of plots come onto the market, or it may be a farmer deciding to sell some land off. But either which way, very often the availability sort of becomes clear via word of mouth. So again, I do always recommend popping into your local mairie if you know the area you'd like to live in, and ask if they know of anything that is for sale or might be for sale or could possibly be for sale. And mayors are generally very welcoming to newcomers into their commune. They're keen to have new people, new families, new blood. So they're often incredibly helpful and will even ask around on your behalf. And they do know what's going on in the locality. So if they know that somebody's mum is in hospital and is on her way out and that plot will be for sale, that's a very good source of information. You can also scout out websites such as Le Bon Coin, Paris Vendu, Facebook groups, and notice boards in local shops and supermarkets and farm supply outlets are also a good source of plots, even properties to rent, those kind of things. So keep your eyes open. You're going to need to search for this gem of a plot. And you could even try placing a wanted advert yourself, because you can use one of the online private sales sites, which have thousands of adverts, and see what that throws up. Now, assuming you've found a plot, the first thing you need to check is whether outline planning permission exists, and if not, is it likely to ever be granted? You may be happy to take a punt on this and think you'll enjoy the land as leisure land and maybe stick a tent or caravan on it when you visit in the summer. Or if it's going to be your permanent residence, it pays to be cautious. So even if the seller assures you there will be no problem building on the land, you absolutely need to pay a visit to the local mairie, who will be able to show you what's called the PLU, or Le Plan Local d'Urbanisme, which is also sometimes known as the POS, or Le Plan d'Occupation des Sols. Now, these plans, which are basically maps, the PLU and POS, they show the various areas of the commune according to their land use. So you will be able to see what your land is designated as being and whether it's constructible or not. Now, if the plot is constructible, you will be able to establish then at that point the size of construction that's going to be allowed, because this is calculated by something known as the COS, or coefficient d'occupation des sols, which is normally shown as a decimal figure. So this means that on a plot, say, of 2,000 square meters, a COS of 0.1 would allow you to build a property of 200 square meters. So pretty generous. But you do need to check the designation of the land, because in our current property, for example, some of it is designated as agricultural, some of it as habitation, and some of it as something else, which I can't remember, even though to us it just seems like the garden. So you will also need to investigate what's known as la limite de la zone constructible, and this tells you where on the plot you're allowed to build. Now, not all plots are subject to this restriction, but again, always best to be forewarned, especially if you really want to construct your home in a certain part of the plot. Now, again, our property was already built, but it is on a hectare, but unfortunately, it's right at the front of the hectare, bang on the road. It would be much nicer if it was at the back of the hectare or in the middle of the hectare. So if you're starting from scratch and you don't want your house right next to the road, make sure you know where it's allowed to go. If you know the size and shape of the house you are planning to build, then it's a really good idea to try and make a scale model and sort of try it out on the plan of the plot and see what it looks like. And if the land is either unusually shaped or a bit irregular, or the constructible area is in only one part of the plot, your planned design might look a bit daft. It might look fine, and you may be able to modify the design of the house to suit the plot. But again, it's always best to think about these kinds of things at the start. And when you visit the mairie, that's the point where you should check on any planning requirements which may be specific to the area. Now, these could include things like pointing or render colours, roof pitches, fencing or materials. For example, in the Pays Basque, you must paint your exterior woodwork Basque red or Basque green, and the walls white. There is no other option. They're kind of quite anti-timber builds there. So check all of that out according to what's allowed or not allowed in your particular area. And you can also check on issues such as rights of way and potential flood risks. Only last night we popped out for a walk around the village and I had a house pointed out to me which has not been sold due to the fact that there is a right of way through the front door via a corridor into the back garden. So check out rights of way. They can be very, very bizarre in France on occasion. Um, if the plot has been noted as being what's called borne, which is when you see small orange markers, which are known as borne, you can also check to see that the position of these actually complies with the boundaries as marked on the cadastral plan. If it hasn't been borne, you may well have to negotiate paying for that with the seller, and that can be a significant expense. So the cadastral plan is a large-scale map of the commune which includes all the marked boundaries. So have a good look at that and see if what you're being shown by the agent or the seller ties in with what's on the cadastral plan. So once you know that it's going to be possible to build a house that you want on your chosen plot, the next stage is to think about practical aspects of building. Now, isolated plots are more than likely to be what's known as non-viabilisé, without services, in other words. So you need to factor in the cost of bringing water, electricity, and I would have said telephone connections, but these days most people don't have a landline and rely on mobile networks. But check out the mobile network at this stage. And each plot is going to be different. So you do need to contact the utility companies for a precise quote rather than relying on ballpark figures or anything that people have posted in Facebook groups. Now, some plots may even be too remote to make a grid connection cost effective, and then you need to decide if you can manage to go it alone. And again, going back to internet, which is basically essential for everybody these days, this is now not such a big deal because you can get satellite installations relatively cheaply, but you do need to sort of think about all of the services that you'll need to make your day-to-day life, I would say livable, but that doesn't make sense, but make your day-to-day life work and think about all the costs. And you also need to remember that a septic tank is probably going to be your only option when it comes to sewage disposal, budget accordingly. And you will need to include details of your planned sewage disposal system when you complete the application form for what's called the Permis de construire, which is literally the paperwork that you fill in before starting to build. Now, you also need to think about access to the plot, because if access is difficult, maybe over a bridge or along a rutted track, then deliveries are going to be difficult. Not a problem in the long term. You can put your big postbox, letterbox at the end of the track and pop down and get it. But in the short term, getting materials onto site and waste removal is also going to be more expensive and take longer to do. Not insurmountable, but again, just something to consider. You do also need to check on the soil type because this could affect the type of foundations you're going to need and thus the overall cost of the build. And I would say this is one area where it's really sensible to consult an expert who is known in France as a geotechnician. Basically, somebody who will come analyse the soil and advise on the exact type of foundations that you need. And if the plot is on a slope, you also need to factor this into your costings. Now, sloping plots can often be cheaper to buy because people often prefer to have a flat garden, and building on a slope can add to the construction costs. However, if you can design for this and budget for this and live with a sloping garden, these type of plots can often lead to some absolutely stunning designs. You could extend a terrace out over the drop away, and you have a bigger terrace and a smaller garden. And in any case, you may be able to use some of the building spoil from your construction to level out the plot. Now, all of this might sound a bit daunting, But I would say that if you think about everything that could pose a problem, it isn't really a problem. And any of the issues that are present in any particular given plot can be overcome. There's always an element of cost involved. So, some things do cost more than others, and you will have to think, is it worth it for this particular plot? Or should I be looking at something else? But as always, in any form of construction or renovation in France or anywhere else, if you do the research and do some planning, the dividends will pay off. And once construction's underway, you will be able to look forward to the day where you're going to be able to sit back on your terrace or deck or wherever and enjoy your new home in its beautifully isolated location, far away from any hustle and bustle and police sirens and annoying neighbours and barking dogs. Unless, of course, you have barking dogs and you're the annoying neighbour. You will also find when you come to buy that since 2006, I believe, every plot sold has to come with a declaration stating whether or not it's situated in a natural, seismic, or man-made risk zone. Now, natural risks are said to include flooding, avalanches, subsidence, and cracking. And the declarations must be dated less than 6 months previously. So you will have some idea of, you will be given that information and you will have some idea of whether or not this is a sensible place to build or whether you're going to need to build a house on massive stilts because it's likely to flood. But given that climate change is and more extreme weather conditions are a kind of ongoing fact of life, I think it's sensible to kind of try and future-proof your property as much as possible and think about all the things that could go wrong in terms of being without power, being flooded, extreme winds, storms, blah, blah, blah. Forewarned is forearmed and all that. I'm going to put some useful vocabulary and site links into the show notes, and I hope that little overview of some of the challenges involved in building on an isolated plot has been useful. I'm sure there's always lots more to say on any subject, but I try and keep these podcasts to about 20 minutes because I'm sure nobody wants to listen to me whittering on for much longer than that. So I hope that's been helpful. I hope it's been useful. As always, if you have any questions or have any specific queries, do get in touch on any of my social media channels or leave a comment on the podcast. Thank you for listening. Thank you, as always, to our wonderful sponsors, Fab French Insurance, who obviously will be your first choice to insure your new home once it's built. Thank you for listening, and I will see you next time. Have a great week.